Welcome back. This is the Ben Shapiro Show. We're taking your calls at 855-236-3228. That's 855-236-3228. Harry in New Jersey on line 4. You're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Harry.
Hi, Ben. I'm a longtime fan of your show in the Daily Wire. However, where I disagree is with your position on freedom of information. You have said that when there is an act of terrorism, do not share names, manifestos, or videos, which implies that the only way to get information is through analysis, which is dangerous in a world of fake news and bias on both sides of the political aisle. So my primary question is, do you believe in total access to information so people can make more informed decisions? Or are you willing to take a position in which governments and large media outlets can outright block this information like the Daily Wire has done in the past under the false pretext that it is done to ensure public safety?
Okay, well, first of all, I don't think it's a false pretext to suggest that if you print the names of mass shooters, there's pretty good social science to suggest that actually is what mass shooters are looking for, and that you actually get copycat shooters. We've seen this already, right? I mean, we've seen manifestos that were posted after the Christchurch shooting, and those manifestos were used as sort of the primary source for other shootings like the El Paso, Texas shooting, people referencing each other's shootings, each other's manifestos, looking for notoriety, looking for coverage. If you deprive people of that coverage, sometimes the theory goes that you minimize the possibility that they participate in the shooting in the first place. I do understand the balancing act, and I've never called for the government to be able to regulate this sort of stuff. So there is a difference between outlets like mine, which, I made the call as editor-in-chief that we are not going to release the names of mass shooters or print the full manifestos of mass shooters. We will talk about the political perspectives so far as those are relevant to acknowledging what exactly motivates particular shooters, but posting the manifestos such that they serve as a bullhorn for the propaganda, that's not something that I'm willing to do. But I certainly acknowledge that governments should not be doing that. I've said that government should not be regulating it, Harry.
Okay, so basically you think that the government shouldn't regulate it, but the Daily Wire will regulate it. But how do you think people can get this kind of information without accessing like dangerous websites if everybody's going to be blocking it across the board?
Well, again, I would hope that they don't access that information. I mean, the purpose of me not printing it is so that they don't access that information. It's the same reason why my website doesn't print Nazi propaganda. Like, I mean, you could make the argument that our website and all websites should print whatever information is submitted to them, no matter how biased or terrible or evil it is, so long as it is quote unquote newsworthy. We all make editorial decisions when we run publications. I choose not to print certain things. Other places choose not to print other things. I think that the risks of let's put it this way, the upside of you knowing the name of a shooter is not worth the downside of potential shooters recognizing that they gain an enormous amount of fame and credibility by having major outlets promote their name. And if you don't like that, you can go to another outlet. I mean, like that's why I say the government shouldn't do that. But I'm not willing to be on a moral level complicit in the distribution of information that I think could heighten the possibility of a mass shooting.
No, that definitely makes a lot of sense. But it's just in the current political climate of false news and false information, when you're only getting analysis rather than being able to see what they're saying for themselves, no matter how evil it is, I think that also does set a dangerous precedent. So
I agree with that, which is why I think that you should always read a couple of different outlets, right? I've always suggested that you should read our outlet, and you should read Huffington Post, and you should read Breitbart, and you should read Washington Post, because the reason you should read multiple outlets is specifically because I'll tell you how we cover mass shooters. So let's say that there's a mass shooter who posts a white supremacist manifesto. And let's say that the mainstream media do what they always do, which is they claim that the person is a Trump supporter, right? Without any evidence, or they find some reference to Trump in the document. Well, then we will post articles talking about the other references in the document, which show that this person is not particularly a Trump supporter, for example, or that this person has other underlying motivations, or that this person has confused motivations, because you're actually correcting the mainstream media bias. That's why I suggest that you should read a well-rounded diet of news sources. I would prefer that people not distribute manifestos generally, because again, that is why people write manifestos, is because they're seeking broad distribution. We can have discussions about those. And again, it is possible to access them, but I rarely believe that acting as a bullhorn for the manifesto outweighs the damage, outweighs the damage done by acting as a bullhorn. Harry, really appreciate your call. Kyle in North Carolina, you're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Kyle.
Hi, Ben. Just after you answer your question, I just want to give you thank you at the very end. But my question is pretty simple. Given the chance that Mayor Bloomberg ends up being the Democratic nominee, do you think that Bernie Sanders and his supporters will support him?
I think it is very unlikely that they do. I mean, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, all of them have been saying that Bloomberg is trying to buy the nomination, and they've been pointing to the fact that he's dumped, hundreds of millions of dollars into advertisements. and then now he'll be on the debate stage after basically just spending his way into a fairly decent position in sort of the national polling. I think that Bernie would pull his support. I think Elizabeth Warren might pull her support. Now, maybe they side behind him to stop Trump, but I think it's very difficult for Bernie to go back to his supporters and say, I've railed against billionaires. Here is the 9th richest person on planet Earth who just dropped $200 million on advertising, and I've been complaining about money in politics, and now I'm going to endorse the guy who is the definition of money in politics and who also happened to start his career as a Republican when I'm a socialist. I think that there's a good shot that the party completely splits if Bloomberg is the nominee, which is why I think that if we get to an open convention, which at this point is starting to look increasingly likely, if we get to an open convention, and let's say that Bernie has a plurality of the voters, he has the capacity to blackmail the party into making him the nominee. I think the chances that the DNC hierarchy takes away Bernie's nomination if Bernie wins 42% of the delegates instead of 52% of the delegates, I think the chances of that are real. I know, Kyle, what do you think?
Yeah, it's pretty wild. I mean, I definitely think 2020 is going to be just a crazy year overall. But yeah, no, I really like your analysis. Thank you very much. I just wanted to say that I've just been a huge fan, a long-time listener, but recently an all-access subscriber, and I love it. And thank you very much. And Epstein didn't kill himself. Thank you.
Okay, that's never going to get old, and I really appreciate the call, Kyle. By the way, if you want to subscribe, go to dailywire.com. DW2020 gives me an opportunity to pitch our subscriptions. DW2020, you get 20% off for now. Also, if you do it like right now, then we are doing a Daily Wire Backstage tonight in which we're going to live cover the State of the Union address. We'll have all sorts of analysis and jokey fun with the Iowa caucuses and all sorts of good times tonight. It's the only way to get through the State of the Union address, which is an interminable exercise in pomposity and idiocy. Let's see. Quentin in Wisconsin, you're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Quentin.
Hi, Ben. Just one thing I really wanted to touch in on. You mentioned a little bit about universal health care. And I, like you, was watching the Iowa caucus last night, and woof, I laughed pretty hard. I don't think a lot of these people are realizing that in order to do this level of universal health care, the people that are implementing it, these other countries, their landmass literally fits in some of our states. Like you could take Germany and stick it in the state of Wisconsin. How would you go about implementing then that idea of universal health care?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of nationalized top-down universal health care is an idiocy on its face. Also, it's amazing to me that so many people have been taken in by the ruse that basically there's only one type of universal health care, that it's a choice between the United States and the UK, that you need to completely nationalize the healthcare system where all the doctors work for a national health service, and you do, in fact, have death panels that decide what kind of care you should be afforded by the federal government. The fact is that there are places like Switzerland where you are supposed to, there's an individual mandate, you're supposed to buy in, but there are private insurers that are competing for your dollar, and the government will subsidize you if you are paying more than a certain percentage of the money that you make into the healthcare system, but they will also punish you if you don't buy healthcare and then you end up having to take advantage of the healthcare system. Singapore has an individual mandate as well, but a rather free market-oriented insurance system. The bottom line is that you can combine elements of government mandates with a free market system. What you can't have, and this was the inherent problem with Obamacare, is you cannot have a situation in which you require an individual mandate and also suggest that insurance companies must be forced to cover pre-existing conditions. Right? You can't really have that. If you're gonna pool care, the only way to pool care is presumably to have a bunch of healthy people paying in. Well, if you're going to do that, then you have to presumably create different risk pools. And Obamacare really didn't do that. They sort of suggested that you could buy a gold-plated healthcare system for a certain amount of money despite pre-existing conditions, and that insurance companies couldn't even take that into account. That creates all sorts of risk variables that really don't work out in practice. But you're right. I mean, when people look at quote-unquote nationalized healthcare systems that work, or socialized healthcare systems that work, they are looking at countries that have populations of 6 million people, right? Populations that are smaller than Los Angeles County, the county where I live. And you see this all the time. You see them taking models from Norway or Denmark that have tiny populations and then suggesting that we can just wholesale apply them in the United States and everything will work out the same. Now, there are differences in culture, there are differences in landmass, there are differences in size, there are differences in policing strategy. If you want to do an apples-to-apples comparison, what you would really have to say is that if you took the healthcare system of Denmark and you applied it to Danish Americans, it might have a similar effect. That I could see. But if you apply it to the broad spectrum of American humanity, that spectrum is pretty large and pretty differential, and it doesn't seem that that's going to apply in quite the same way. Quentin, really appreciate the call.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Let's see. Phil in Chicago, Illinois. You're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Phil.
Hey, Ben. First of all, just got to get you away from the dark side of the White Sox and over to the Cubs, but that's a conversation for a different story. So my question pertains to the judicial philosophy of originalism and why it's best. So I'm not a lawyer, so I don't have much educational background on this topic. But when I read about it and listen to people like you and Ted Cruz and Amy Coney Barrett speak about originalism, obviously Scalia, the idea of it makes a lot of sense to me as a judge. But you, as many historians, have been critical of the Dred Scott decision back in 1857.
Yes.
And my question is, how does originalism not arrive at the same conclusion that Roger Taney did in that decision? And just real quick, he famously said, Roger Taney, the Chief Justice at the time, said, Black people are, quote, not included and were not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges which that instrument provides. Yada, yada, yada. So from an originalist standpoint, wasn't he right about that conclusion? Because it required constitutional amendments to ultimately overturn that decision. So How do you square those two things?
Right. Okay. Together? So Robert Bork, who was one of the chief originalists, he wrote in his book Tempting of America about Dred Scott. To understand why Dred Scott is wrongly decided along originalist grounds, you have to actually look at the constitutional grounds cited by Justice Taney in the Supreme Court in suggesting that it was illegal for a state to create a citizen out of a black citizen. I mean, that's really what this is about, right? Dred Scott was brought from a slave state. He was a slave. He was brought from a slave state into a free state. And then he claimed, I'm a citizen of this free state, right? Because in this state, I am a citizen, as opposed to that other state where I was a slave. And the Supreme Court declared you cannot be made a citizen when you are not a citizen in one state, right? So you weren't a citizen in the slave state, but now you move to the free state. They should be able to recapture you, bring you back into slavery in the old state because nothing, quote unquote, makes you a national citizen or even a citizen of the state where you claim that you are a citizen. In order to achieve that result, it's not just that Taney had to discuss what citizenship constitutes under the Constitution. He had to suggest that one state, a free state, saying, no, this guy's now a citizen of our state, had to be made subservient to the opinions of the slave state, right? Because it was a conflict between the states. There was a conflict between, I believe it was the state of Missouri and the state of Kansas, if I'm not mistaken, but I'd have to try and recall which states he actually moved to. In any case, what happened there is that Justice Taney then suggested that there was something called substantive due process. A substantive due process is the idea that you have been deprived of life, liberty, or life or liberty or property without due process of law. And so the Dred Scott's quote unquote owners filed a lawsuit and they claimed that they'd been removed of their property without due process of law. Well, there was due process of law. The process of law is that another state where they had brought a human being declared that this person was a citizen. So what Taney did is he said, sure, there was a due process, there was a trial, right? There was a trial court that decided all of this, and there was a procedure in the state, but it was not true due process because true due process would not have allowed this property to be removed. That was the Supreme Court supplanting its own judgment for the judgment of the state and suggesting that due process was no longer a question of whether there was a process, but of whether the process itself was fair in the view of Justice Taney. Okay, and that is actually more the basis of decisions like Roe versus Wade, right? Roe versus Wade uses substantive due process in order to say that you've been deprived of your liberty without due process of law because there are abortion laws on the book. So there are two errors in Dred Scott. One is the federal Constitution does not actually define what a human being is, right? It doesn't define what citizenship constitutes, which means that states do get to have differential statements about what citizenship constitutes, which was the case in the early United States, right? This was the case. There were free black people who were living in the North and they were full citizens of the North. And then there were slave black people who were living under horrific slavery in the South. And it wasn't illegal for the northern states to basically say, no, these people are citizens up here. This is why Abraham Lincoln suggested that Dred Scott was an attempt to nationalize slavery. It was an attempt to say that in the new territories, no new territory could declare a black person free. Instead, they were slaves under the Constitution. That obviously was not true. The original bargain is that black people were going to be slaves in certain states, unfortunately, and black people were going to be free in other states. Justice Taney nationalized slavery using substantive due process, which is anti-originalist, which is why the Dred Scott decision is both wrong and set the precedent for an enormous line of judicial abuses that goes on all the way until today, Phil. That's the basic legal theory.
Hey, Ben, so that makes a lot of sense. And I really feel that if the country understood originalism more, a republic would be so much more healthy in terms of like the volatility of politics and the temperature being risen. If people all sort of bought into originalism, that would be so much more healthy for our republic.
Certainly. I mean, at least acknowledging that it's not the judge's role to make law, because what Taney actually did was make law, right? He was a judicial activist in the originalist sense. Okay, Phil, really appreciate the call. We'll get to more of your calls at 855-236-3228 momentarily.